The stench hit Marcus Chun like a physical blow as he stepped off the transport shuttle onto Vortak Prime. It wasn't just the sulfur-heavy atmosphere that made his eyes water. It was the unmistakable smell of fear, pain, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Something that made his stomach churn with a primal rage he'd learned to control during his years as a xenobiologist for the Terran Alliance. The spaceport buzzed with activity. Tall, reptilian Vorthakians moved through the crowds with their characteristic grace, their scales shifting colors and patterns Marcus had studied, but never fully understood. Some carried ornate staffs topped with glowing crystals. Others wore elaborate robes that seemed to shimmer with their own light. But what caught Marcus's attention wasn't the impressive display of alien culture. It was the sound coming from beyond the main terminal. A low, mournful keening that seemed to resonate in his bones. Dr. Chun, his guide, a young Vorthakian named Thesic, approached with obvious nervousness. The translator device, clipped to Marcus's ear, rendered the alien's hissing speech into crisp English. The breeding facility administrator is waiting. We should not delay. Marcus shouldered his equipment bag and followed Thesic through the terminal, but his attention kept drifting toward that haunting sound. It grew stronger as they walked, accompanied now by what sounded like sharp cracks and muffled impacts. His jaw tightened. In his 20 years studying alien life forms across the galaxy, he learned to recognize the sounds of suffering in any language. The Vorthakian Empire had invited him here to consult on what they called reproductive optimization for their dragon breeding programs. Dragons, or rather, the creatures the universal translators rendered as dragons, were one of the galaxy's most fascinating species. Highly intelligent, capable of limited shape-shifting, and possessing what could only be described as magical abilities, they had once ruled vast swaths of space before the Vorthakians had conquered and enslaved them centuries ago. The official story was that dragons were too dangerous to remain free, too powerful, and unpredictable. The Vorthakians claimed they provided them with care and purpose, using their abilities for mining operations, construction, and military applications. Marcus had agreed to the consultation because he'd hoped to study dragon biology and psychology, potentially finding ways to improve their living conditions. He was beginning to suspect he'd walked into something much darker. They exited the terminal into the harsh crimson sunlight of Vortak Prime's twin stars. Before them stretched a vast complex of low, windowless buildings surrounded by energy barriers that hummed with barely contained power. Guard towers dotted the perimeter, manned by heavily armed Vorthakians whose scales had shifted to aggressive warning colors. The central breeding facility, Thesic announced with obvious pride, the largest dragon breeding operation in the sector. We produce over 2,000 hatchlings annually. The keening sound was louder now, and Marcus could make out individual voices within the chorus of anguish. His hands clenched into fists as they approached the main gate. The guards scanned them with handheld devices before waving them through, but not before Marcus caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. To his left, barely visible through the shimmering energy barrier, a massive dragon lay chained to the ground. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the creature's once magnificent scales were dull and scarred, its wings torn and healing badly. Around its neck was a thick collar that pulsed with sickly yellow light. A control device, Marcus realized with growing horror. But what truly struck him was the dragon's eyes. Even at this distance, even through the distortion of the barrier, he could see intelligence there. Pain, yes, but also something that looked disturbingly like hope as the creature noticed his stare. "Come," Thesic urged, tugging at Marcus's sleeve with surprising strength. Administrator Vex High grows impatient with delays. They entered the main building, and Marcus immediately wished they hadn't. The corridor was lined with viewing windows that looked into containment cells. In each cell, dragons of various sizes and colors lay in different states of distress. Some paced frantically within their confined spaces. Others had simply given up, and lay motionless except for the slight rise and fall of their breathing. But it was the nursery that nearly broke Marcus's carefully maintained professional composure. Dozens of dragon hatchlings, none larger than house cats, huddled together in sterile metal cages. Their scales should have been bright and iridescent, but instead appeared dull and listless. Many bore the same collar devices as the adults, albeit smaller versions. And moving between the cages with methodical efficiency were Vorthakian handlers carrying what looked like cattle prods. Marcus stopped walking. What exactly are those devices for? Thesic followed his gaze, and his scales shifted to a pleased purple hue. Behavioral modification tools. Very advanced. They deliver precisely calibrated neural disruption pulses to encourage compliance. The hatchlings learn quickly that cooperation brings less discomfort. The clinical way Thesic described torture made Marcus's vision blur with rage for a moment. He forced himself to breathe deeply, to remember why he was here. Losing his temper now wouldn't help these creatures. They continued down the corridor until they reached a large office overlooking what appeared to be a training arena. Through the reinforced windows, Marcus watched as a young dragon, probably no more than a few years old but already the size of a small aircraft, was forced through a series of humiliating exercises. Every time the creature hesitated or failed to perform correctly, multiple handlers would activate shock weapons that sent the dragon writhing to the ground. Magnificent, isn't it? The voice came from behind them, speaking in heavily accented but fluent Standard Galactic. Marcus turned to see a Vorthakian even larger than most, whose scales bore the deep red and gold patterns that indicated high rank. I am HFY, administrator of this facility. You must be the Terran specialist we requested. Marcus forced himself to remain calm as he shook the alien's offered hand. HFY's grip was cold and slightly damp like touching a snake. Dr. Marcus Chun, I understand you're having issues with your breeding program? Indeed. HFY gestured toward the arena where the young dragon had collapsed from exhaustion, its handlers standing over it with their weapons ready. We require more female hatchlings. The males are useful for heavy labor and mining, but females produce the eggs we need to maintain our operation. Unfortunately, we're seeing a concerning trend toward male births. Marcus watched as the handlers forced the exhausted dragon to its feet and made it resume the training exercises. What's the current ratio? Roughly 4 males to every female. Most inefficient. HFY's scales shifted to an annoyed orange pattern. We've tried various environmental modifications, dietary changes, even selective breeding programs. Nothing has produced satisfactory results. And what happens to the males you don't need? Various applications. Labor, military use, gladiatorial combat for entertainment. HFY spoke as if discussing the disposal of industrial waste. Some are simply terminated if they prove too difficult to train or if we have excess inventory. Marcus had to grip the edge of the window to keep his hand steady. I see. And the females? Ah, yes. Would you like to see our breeding females? They're the crown jewel of our operation. Without waiting for an answer, HFY led them deeper into the complex. They passed through several more security checkpoints, each more elaborate than the last, until they reached what appeared to be a heavily fortified section of the facility. The first thing Marcus noticed was that the keening sound was much louder here and distinctly different. Where the other dragons had cried out in pain or fear, these voices carried notes of something far worse. Despair so profound it seemed to darken the very air around them. Our breeding females, HFY announced as they entered a vast chamber lined with dozens of individual cells, each one capable of producing 6 to 8 eggs per cycle. Marcus looked into the nearest cell and felt something break inside his chest. The dragon within had once been magnificent. Even now, broken and imprisoned, she was easily 20 meters from nose to tail, with scales that shifted through deep blues and purples like the depths of an ocean. But her wings had been surgically removed. Marcus could see the crude scars where they'd been severed. Her legs were shackled with heavy chains that allowed her just enough movement to eat and perform her biological functions. But worst of all was her belly, grotesquely swollen with eggs that her body was being forced to produce at an unnatural rate. Medical devices attached to her sides monitored her condition, while others pumped her full of hormones and nutrients designed to maximize her reproductive output. The dragon's head turned toward the viewing window, and Marcus found himself looking into eyes that held more intelligence and pain than he'd ever seen in any sentient being. She looked directly at him, and in that moment, Marcus understood that she knew exactly what was happening to her. She was aware, she was suffering, and she had been for who knew how many years. "Impressive, isn't she?" HFY was saying, apparently oblivious to Marcus's growing horror. "This particular female has produced over 300 eggs in the past 5 cycles. Our medical staff keeps her in peak condition." Marcus moved to the next cell, then the next, and found variations of the same nightmare. Dragons who had been reduced to biological machines, their only purpose to produce eggs that would hatch into more slaves for the Vorthakian Empire. Some had been imprisoned so long their scales had lost all color, fading to a dull gray that spoke of hope dying by inches. In the 4th cell, something caught Marcus's attention. This dragon was smaller than the others, her scales still retaining hints of their original golden color. But what made him stop was the sound she was making, not the keening cry of despair he'd been hearing, but something softer, almost melodic. "What is she doing?" Marcus asked. Fessick glanced at the dragon with obvious distaste. "Singing to her eggs. It's a biological imperative in their species. The females sing to their unhatched young. Quite useless, really, but we haven't found a way to stop it without damaging their reproductive capacity." Marcus pressed closer to the viewing window. The dragon's song was hauntingly beautiful, full of notes that seemed to convey love, hope, and promises of a freedom she would never know. As he watched, he realized that several other dragons throughout the chamber had begun to join in, their voices weaving together in a harmony that transcended species barriers. They were singing lullabies to children they would never see grow up free. "The males you mentioned," Marcus said carefully, "the ones born to these females. What happens to them?" "Removed immediately after hatching, of course. The females become attached if left with their young too long. It interferes with the next reproductive cycle." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process the systematic cruelty he was witnessing. When he opened them again, he found the golden dragon looking directly at him. Her song had stopped, and she was studying him with an intensity that made him feel as if she were looking into his soul. And then, impossibly, she spoke. The words came not through sound, but directly into his mind, bypassing his translator entirely. The mental voice was female, melodious despite the pain that colored every syllable. "Help us." Marcus jerked back from the window, his heart racing. Dragons were known to be telepathic, but he'd never experienced it firsthand. The directness of the contact, the desperate hope contained in those 2 simple words, hit him like a physical blow. HFY was still talking, oblivious to what had just occurred. "Which brings us to the primary issue. We need to increase the female birth ratio to 70% minimum. Your reputation in xenobiological reproduction modification precedes you, Dr. Chen. We're prepared to pay quite handsomely for a solution." Marcus forced himself to focus on the conversation while his mind raced. "I'll need to study your current methods in detail. Run some tests. Review your genetic records. Of course, Fessick will provide you with whatever data you require." HFY's scales shifted to a pleased yellow. "We've prepared quarters for you in the residential section. You may begin your work immediately." As they turned to leave, Marcus glanced back at the golden dragon. She was watching him still, and this time her mental voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. "Please." The residential section was a stark contrast to the breeding facility. Comfortable rooms with actual windows, decent food, and what passed for amenities on an alien world. Marcus barely noticed any of it. His mind was churning with what he'd seen, trying to reconcile the scientific opportunity he'd thought he was accepting with a moral atrocity he'd discovered. He'd come to Vorthak Prime thinking he might help improve conditions for captive dragons while advancing human understanding of one of the galaxy's most fascinating species. Instead, he found himself witness to what could only be described as genocide being carried out with industrial efficiency. Thesic had provided him with access to the facility's databases, and Marcus spent the next several hours reviewing the records with growing horror. The Vorthakians had been perfecting their dragon breeding program for over 2 centuries. They'd experimented with every conceivable method of controlling reproduction, from environmental manipulation to surgical modification to psychological conditioning. But what struck him most was the intelligence evident in the dragons' responses to their captivity. These weren't simple animals being farmed. They were sentient beings with complex social structures, emotional bonds, and cultural traditions that the Vorthakians were systematically destroying. The mortality rates were staggering. Less than 60% of hatchlings survived to adulthood, and those that did face life expectancies barely a quarter of what wild dragons experienced. The breeding females lived slightly longer, but only because they were kept alive to produce more eggs. Their psychological profiles showed consistent patterns of severe depression, anxiety, and what human doctors would have diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. Marcus was deep into medical files when he came across something that made him stop reading entirely. Buried in a subsection about problematic behaviors was a note about dragons who had somehow learned to influence the gender of their offspring. According to the report, some females had developed the ability to consciously bias their eggs toward producing male hatchlings. The Vorthakians had been trying to suppress this ability for decades, but the dragons kept finding new ways to ensure their daughters would never have to endure what they experienced. They were choosing to condemn their male children to lives of labor and violence rather than subject any female to the horror of the breeding program. It was, Marcus realized, an act of love so profound and heartbreaking that it reframed everything he'd seen that day. These dragons weren't just victims. They were resistance fighters, using the only weapon they had left, their own biology. Marcus leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He'd been brought here to help the Vorthakians increase the production of female dragons, to make it easier for them to trap more sentient beings in lives of forced reproduction and suffering. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Outside his window, the alien stars of the Vorthak system painted the sky in unfamiliar patterns. Somewhere in the darkness beyond them lay human space, where the Terran Alliance prided itself on principles of freedom, dignity, and the protection of sentient rights. But those principles meant nothing here, in this place where an entire species was being slowly, methodically destroyed. Marcus made his decision. He wasn't going to help the Vorthakians breed more dragons. He was going to find a way to free them all. The golden dragon's voice echoed in his memory. Help us. He would. Whatever it took, however long it required, whatever the consequences might be, he would find a way. The human had always been told he had a talent for impossible problems. It was time to put that reputation to the test. Marcus spent the next 3 days playing the role of a dedicated xenobiologist while secretly mapping the facility's security systems and gathering intelligence. He made careful notes about guard rotations, observed the placement of surveillance equipment, and studied the energy barriers that kept the dragons contained. To any observer, he appeared to be conducting legitimate research on dragon reproductive biology. In reality, he was planning a jailbreak. The facility's databases revealed information that made his mission even more urgent. The Vorthakians weren't just breeding dragons for labor. They were actively working to eliminate certain genetic traits that made dragons difficult to control. Intelligence, telepathic ability, and what the files referred to as magical resistance were being systematically bred out of the population. The dragons were being made weaker, more docile, and less capable of defending themselves with each generation. If Marcus didn't act soon, the magnificent beings he'd encountered might be reduced to little more than intelligent livestock within a few decades. His opportunity came on the fourth morning when Thesic informed him that Administrator Vexhai had been called away on urgent business. The administrator will return in 3 days, the young Vorthakian explained, his scales flickering with nervous energy. He has instructed me to provide you with whatever assistance you require in his absence. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Actually, I'd like to conduct some direct behavioral observations. The file suggests that the breeding females exhibit certain stress responses that might be affecting their reproduction. I need to study them in person, perhaps take some biological samples. Thesic's scales shifted to an uncertain blue-green. Direct contact with the breeding stock requires special authorization. The dragons can be unpredictable. I understand the risks, Marcus assured him. But I can't properly diagnose the reproductive issues without hands-on examination. Your administrator specifically asked me to identify the problem with female birth rates. After some hesitation and several communications with higher authorities, Thesic arranged for Marcus to enter the breeding chamber with a full security escort. The guard were heavily armed and wore protective gear that Marcus recognized as anti-telepathic shielding. Apparently, the Vorthakians had learned to fear dragon mental abilities. Marcus was given a similar helmet, but he'd already modified it during his first night in quarters. A few careful adjustments to the circuitry had effectively disabled the telepathic blocking while maintaining the appearance of functionality. If anyone scanned him, they'd see the device reading as fully operational. The breeding chamber felt different when Marcus entered it with permission. The guards kept their distance from the cells, their weapons ready, but their obvious nervousness gave Marcus a small advantage. They were afraid of the dragons, which meant they were unlikely to observe too closely what he was actually doing. He approached the first cell with his medical scanner in hand, making a show of taking readings while actually trying to establish mental contact with the dragon inside. This female was older than the golden dragon he'd spoken to before. Her scales faded to the color of old bone, her eyes clouded with cataracts that spoke of years in captivity. When he pressed his hand against the viewing window, her mental voice came through clearly, though weak with exhaustion. Another examiner. More tests. More pain. I'm not here to hurt you. Marcus projected back, hoping his untrained telepathic attempt would reach her. I want to help. The dragon's head snapped up, her clouded eyes focusing on him with sudden intensity. You hear us? How? I'm human. We have some telepathic potential, though most of us never develop it. Marcus kept his voice calm while pretending to study his scanner readings. I'm going to get you out of here. Impossible. But even as she said it, Marcus could feel a flutter of hope in the dragon's mental voice. The barriers, the guards, the collars, we have tried for generations to escape. I have advantages you don't, Marcus replied. I can move freely, access their computer systems, communicate with the outside galaxy. Tell me, how many of you are there in total? The dragon was silent for a moment, and Marcus sensed her communicating with others throughout the facility. Dragons, he realized, maintained a constant telepathic network among themselves, sharing information and emotional support despite their physical separation. 47 breeding females in this section, 112 males in the labor compounds, 341 juveniles in various stages of training, 816 hatchlings in the nurseries. Marcus felt the breath leave his lungs. Over 1,300 dragons, all imprisoned, all suffering. The scope of what he was contemplating suddenly seemed overwhelming. There are more facilities, the dragon continued. Dozens of them across Vorthakian space. Tens of thousands of our people in bondage. One step at a time, Marcus told himself as much as her. I'll start here, then we'll see about the others. But I need your help. All of you need to be ready to move when I give a signal. He spent the next hour moving through the breeding chamber, ostensibly collecting samples, but actually establishing contact with every dragon he could reach. Each conversation was heartbreaking. These females have been imprisoned for decades, watching their children taken away, their bodies used as manufacturing equipment for their captors' benefit. But each conversation also revealed the incredible strength and intelligence that had kept them alive despite unimaginable cruelty. These dragons had not broken. They had endured, they had adapted, and they had been waiting for exactly the opportunity Marcus represented. The golden dragon he'd first spoken to was named Lyralii, and she had been captive for 18 years, nearly half her life. When Marcus approached her cell, her mental voice was stronger than the others, colored with an intensity that suggested leadership. "The others tell me you claim to be planning rescue," she said without preamble. "Explain how a single human intends to overcome centuries of Vorthakian security." Marcus glanced around to ensure the guards weren't paying too much attention, then pressed his palm against her viewing window. "Because humans are very, very good at breaking things we don't like. And because I'm not planning to do this alone." He quickly outlined his plan, such as it was. It relied heavily on the fact that the Vorthakians considered humans a relatively minor species, useful allies, but not particularly threatening. They wouldn't expect a human scientist to attempt something as audacious as a mass prison break, which gave him the element of surprise. More importantly, Marcus had spent his years traveling the galaxy building relationships with dozens of other species. Many of them owed him favors, and several had reasons to dislike the Vorthakian Empire's aggressive expansion policies. A few carefully worded communications had already confirmed that help would be available if he could create the right opportunity. "The key is coordination," Marcus explained. "I can disable the security systems and energy barriers, but only for a limited time before they reboot with backup power. You'll need to be ready to move the moment the barriers drop." "And our collars?" Lyralii asked, touching the device around her neck with obvious hatred. Marcus smiled grimly. "Those are actually the easiest part. I've been studying the control frequencies in the facility's database. They're controlled by a central transmitter that I can overload from the security office. Without the collars, you'll have access to your full abilities again." "Our magic," she whispered, and Marcus felt her mental presence flare with something that might have been joy. "We haven't felt our true power in so long." "There's something else," Marcus continued. "I know about what you've been doing, influencing the gender of your offspring to prevent more females from ending up here. It's incredible what you've managed despite everything they've done to you." Lyralii's mental voice turned sad. "We save our daughters by condemning our sons. It is a choice no mother should have to make. After tonight, you won't have to make it anymore." Marcus spent the rest of the day finalizing his preparations. He'd already planted several viruses in the facility's computer systems, designed to activate simultaneously and create maximum chaos. He'd also been slowly stockpiling medical supplies and emergency equipment in his quarters, ostensibly for his research, but actually to treat injured dragons once the escape began. Most importantly, he'd established contact with Captain Sarah Runningbear of the Terran heavy cruiser Defiant, currently on patrol 3 systems away. Sarah was an old friend from Marcus's academy days, and she'd readily agreed to assist when he'd explained the situation. The Defiant was officially conducting routine diplomatic missions, but it would be ready to jump to Vorthak Prime at a moment's notice. As evening approached, Marcus felt the familiar mix of excitement and terror that came before any dangerous undertaking. He'd been in tight situations before. His xenobiological work had taken him to war zones, plague worlds, and planets with hostile native life forms. But he never attempted anything quite so ambitious or with stakes quite so high. If he failed, over 1,000 sentient beings would pay the price for his arrogance. If he succeeded, he'd be striking a blow against one of the galaxy's most entrenched systems of oppression. Marcus checked his equipment one final time as Vorthak Prime's twin suns sat behind the facility's walls. Hidden in his medical bag were explosive charges he'd improvised from cleaning supplies and emergency oxygen canisters. His personal communicator had been modified to broadcast on frequencies that would interfere with the dragon's control collars. And sewn into his jacket were data chips containing every file from the facility's databases, evidence of Orthakian war crimes that would hopefully see justice done even if he didn't survive the night. At exactly midnight local time, Marcus made his move. The facility's night shift was smaller than the day crew, but the security systems were actually more sophisticated after dark. Marcus had spent hours studying the patrol patterns and surveillance rotations, looking for the brief windows when certain areas would be unmonitored. His first stop was the main security office, where a lone Vorthakian guard monitored dozens of screens showing different sections of the facility. Marcus approached the office casually, carrying his medical bag and wearing the expression of a scientist dealing with an unexpected problem. "Excuse me," he said as he knocked on the office door. "I'm having some issues with the biological monitoring equipment in Section 7. The readings are showing critical alerts, but I can't access the control interface from my quarters." The guard looked up from his screens with obvious annoyance, his scales shifting to an irritated orange. "Dr. Chun, you should not be in this area after dark without escort." "I know, but this can't wait until morning," Marcus insisted, projecting an air of scientific urgency. "If one of the breeding females goes into distress overnight, Administrator Vexhai will want to know why no one responded to the alerts." The mention of their superior's name worked as Marcus had hoped. The guard grudgingly activated the door lock and gestured him inside. "Make it quick. I have rounds to complete." Marcus nodded and approached the monitoring console, ostensibly checking the readings while actually palming one of his improvised devices. The small charge was designed to overload the facility's main power grid, but he needed to be out of the security office before it detonated. "These readings look normal to me," the guard said, moving closer to look over Marcus's shoulder. "Yes, they seem to have stabilized," Marcus agreed, quickly stepping back from the console. "Thank you for the access. I'll return to my quarters now." As he reached the door, Marcus pressed the activation button on his hidden detonator. He had 30 seconds to get clear of the blast radius. He managed 28. The explosion ripped through the security office with devastating effect, not only destroying the monitoring equipment, but also severing the main power conduits that fed the facility's control systems. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the complex, bathing everything in an eerie red glow, while klaxons began wailing to alert the guards that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Marcus picked himself up from where the blast had thrown him against the corridor wall, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. He had a probable concussion and definitely some cracked ribs, but he was functional enough to continue with the mission. Phase 1 was complete. Now came the hard part. The power failure had automatically locked down most of the facility's doors, but Marcus had planned for that contingency. His modified communicator was broadcasting a signal that would interfere with the dragon's control collars, but it would only be effective for a limited time before the backup systems came online. He made his way through the darkened corridors toward the breeding chamber, avoiding the main passages where emergency response teams were already mobilizing. The Vorthakians were disciplined and well-trained, but they were also dealing with multiple system failures simultaneously. Marcus had planted smaller charges throughout the facility, timed to detonate at irregular intervals, and keep the guards too busy to coordinate an effective response. When he reached the breeding chamber, he found chaos. The energy barriers containing the dragons were flickering unstably, their emitters struggling to function on emergency power. More importantly, several of the dragons were already beginning to move, their collars sparking and failing as Marcus's interference signal did its work. "Now!" Marcus shouted, hoping his voice would carry to the telepathic network he knew connected all the dragons. "The barriers are down. Move now." What happened next would haunt Marcus's dreams for the rest of his life, but not from horror. From sheer, overwhelming awe. Lyralii was the first to break free, her collar finally failing completely as she reached full access to her magical abilities for the first time in 18 years. The golden dragon's eyes blazed with power that seemed to illuminate the entire chamber as she drew upon energies Marcus couldn't even begin to understand. She simply walked through the energy barrier as if it weren't there, the remaining charge dissipating harmlessly against her scales. Behind her, the other breeding females began to follow, their own powers awakening as the collar network continued to fail. But it was what they did next that truly demonstrated why the Vorthakians had worked so hard to keep these creatures imprisoned. Instead of fleeing immediately, the dragons turned their attention to the facility's other sections. Marcus watched in amazement as Lyralii placed her Talon hand against the wall and simply knew the location of every other dragon in the complex. Her telepathic abilities, no longer suppressed by the control collar, reached out across the entire facility to coordinate with her fellow prisoners. "The younglings first," she said, and Marcus realized she was speaking aloud now, so he could understand. "Then the males. None of our people will be left behind." What followed was the most perfectly executed prison break Marcus had ever witnessed. The dragons moved through the facility with purpose and coordination that spoke of years of planning and preparation. They had been studying their prison for decades, learning every weakness, mapping every passage, waiting for exactly this opportunity. The breeding females, despite their years of captivity and forced reproduction, moved like the apex predators they had always been. Their magic allowed them to melt through locked doors, disable security systems, and navigate the complex in total darkness. The younger dragons they freed joined the effort immediately, their smaller size allowing them to access areas the adults couldn't reach. But it was when they reached the males in the labor compounds that Marcus truly understood what he had set in motion. These dragons had been broken differently than the breeding females, conditioned through violence and deprivation to serve as beasts of burden. Many of them had been captive since hatching, knowing no life other than endless work and brutal punishment. Marcus expected them to be too damaged, too traumatized to participate effectively in the escape. He was wrong. The moment their collars failed and their telepathic abilities returned, the male dragons reconnected with the network they had been cut off from since birth. The reunion was visible as much as it was telepathic. Dragons who had never been allowed to touch another of their kind suddenly found themselves surrounded by family, by packmates, by a community they had never known existed. The transformation was immediate and devastating to their former captors. Dragons who had been broken by years of abuse suddenly remembered what they had been before the Vorthakians stole their freedom. The rage that followed was terrible and righteous, and the guards who tried to stop them discovered just how much raw power they had been keeping chained all these years. Marcus found himself caught up in the exodus as over 1,000 dragons moved through the facility like a force of nature. He stayed close to Lyralii, partly for protection, but mostly because he was beginning to realize that this was bigger than just a prison break. This was a revolution. The dragons moved with a purpose that went beyond simple escape. They were systematically destroying every piece of equipment used to control and abuse their kind, melting the breeding chambers to slag, vaporizing the collar manufacturing facilities, and erasing every database that contained information about their biology and psychology. They were making sure that what had happened to them could never happen again. By the time the Vorthakian response teams got organized enough to mount a counterattack, they discovered that they no longer had anything to counterattack against. The dragons had already completed their primary objective and vanished into the night sky of Vorthak Prime, their natural flight abilities returning along with their magic. Marcus stood in the ruins of the breeding facility, watching the last of the dragons disappear into the darkness above. He should have been terrified. He was a human alone on an alien world, surrounded by the wreckage of what had been a major industrial facility. The Vorthakians would undoubtedly blame him for what had happened, and his diplomatic immunity would only protect him so far. But he wasn't afraid. He was exhilarated. Lyralii's voice touched his mind one final time before she flew beyond telepathic range. "This is not the end, Marcus Chun. This is the beginning. You have given us back our power, and we will not forget. The Vorthakians have made an enemy they are not prepared to face." "What will you do now?" Marcus asked. "What we should have done long ago," came the reply. "We will remember who we are, and we will teach the galaxy to remember as well." As the dragons vanished into the night, Marcus activated his emergency communicator and sent a message to the Defiant. "Sarah, this is Marcus. I need that pickup we discussed, and you might want to bring some reporters. I've got a story the galaxy needs to hear." The Terran heavy cruiser Defiant arrived at Vorthak Prime 6 hours after Marcus sent his emergency signal. By then, the Dragon Liberation had become the top news story across 3 sectors, and Captain Sarah Running Bear found herself at the center of the biggest diplomatic crisis in decades. Marcus was officially in Vorthakian custody, though the circumstances were unusual enough that no one was quite sure what to do with him. He sat in a comfortable detention cell aboard Administrator Vexhi's personal flagship, watching news feed from across the galaxy while Vorthakian officials tried to figure out how to handle the situation. The dragons hadn't simply disappeared after their escape. They had done something far more dangerous to the Vorthakian Empire. They had started talking. Within hours of the breakout, dragon testimony was being broadcast on every major news network in the galaxy. The telepathic recordings Lyralii and her companions shared were more powerful than any documentary could have been. Viewers across dozens of worlds experienced firsthand the anguish of mothers watching their children taken away, felt the despair of intelligent beings reduced to biological machines, and understood the systematic cruelty that had been hidden behind the Vorthakians' claims of humane management. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. "Dr. Chun," Administrator Vexhi said as he entered Marcus's cell, his scales flickering through patterns that Marcus had learned indicated extreme agitation. "You have created a significant diplomatic incident." Marcus looked up from a news feed he'd been watching. The latest story showed crowds of protesters outside Vorthakian embassies on 17 different worlds, demanding justice for the dragons and sanctions against the Empire. "I've exposed the truth about what you've been doing here." The diplomatic incident was already happening. People just didn't know about it yet. "You had no authority to interfere with lawful Vorthakian activities," Vexhi insisted, though his conviction seemed shaky. "These dragons are property of the Empire, legally acquired through right of conquest." "Sentient beings can't be property," Marcus replied calmly. "And I notice you're not denying what they're saying about the conditions they were kept in." Vexhi's scales shifted to angry red, but before he could respond, an aide appeared at the cell door. The younger Vorthakian whispered something in their administrator's ear that made Vexhi's coloration fade to a sickly yellow. "What is it?" Marcus asked. "The Terran Alliance has filed formal charges against the Empire with the Galactic Council," Vexhi said slowly. "They're claiming violation of the Sapient Rights Accords and demanding immediate access to all dragon breeding facilities for inspection." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. Sarah Running Bear had clearly done more than just pick up her old friend. She'd also made sure the right people back home understood exactly what they were dealing with. And Marcus prompted. 7 other major powers have signed on as co-plaintiffs. Vexhi continued, his voice growing weaker. The Centaurian Federation, the Altarian Republic, the Rigel Concordat. Even the Silicon Communes are demanding answers. The Silicon Communes were artificial intelligences who rarely involved themselves in organic politics, but they had strong opinions about the abuse of sentient beings. Their support for the Dragon's cause was particularly damaging to the Vorthakian position, since it was hard to argue that dragons weren't truly sentient when even AIs recognized their intelligence. Perhaps, Marcus suggested carefully, it would be better to focus on finding a solution rather than assigning blame. Before Vexhi could respond, new alarms began sounding throughout the ship. Marcus could hear running footsteps in the corridors and the kind of urgent communications chatter that indicated something serious was happening. A few minutes later, Thesic appeared at the cell door, his scales cycling rapidly through colors Marcus didn't recognize. "Administrator," Thesic gasped, "we have a situation. Long-range sensors are detecting multiple contacts approaching Vorthak Prime. They're not responding to hails." "Pirates?" Vexhi asked hopefully. "No, sir. The energy signatures match dragon magical abilities, but they're much stronger than anything in our records. And there are a lot of them. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. He'd known the escaped dragons wouldn't simply disappear, but he hadn't expected them to return so quickly, or apparently with reinforcements. How many? Vethai demandet. Current count is over 300 individual contacts, sir, and they appear to be organized in military formations. The implications hit everyone in the cell simultaneously. The dragons hadn't just escaped. They had found others of their kind and convinced them to join a counterattack against their former captors. I need to speak with them, Marcus said urgently. If they're coming back for revenge, a lot of people are going to die, but they might listen to me. Vexai stared at him for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded to Thesic. Bring him to the bridge, and get me a communication channel to the lead dragon formation. The bridge of the Vorthakian flagship was a scene of barely controlled chaos. Officers at dozens of stations were tracking the approaching dragons while trying to coordinate with planetary defense forces and other ships in the system. The main view screen showed a tactical display that made Marcus's blood run cold. The dragons were approaching in perfect military formation, organized into squadrons with clear command structures and sophisticated coordination. These weren't the broken, traumatized refugees who had escaped the breeding facility. These were free dragons who had never been conquered, and they were coming to settle accounts with their people's oppressors. Dr. Chun, Vexhai said as Marcus was escorted onto the bridge, please understand that if this becomes a battle, the Empire will defend itself with full force. We have orbital weapon platforms, military vessels, and ground-based defenses. Many dragons will die, and so will many Vorthakians, Marcus replied grimly. Is that really what you want? A war that could have been avoided. The communication officer looked up from his station. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the lead dragon formation. They're requesting to speak with the human who freed the captives. Marcus stepped forward. Put them through. The main view screen shifted to show the interior of what appeared to be a dragon-designed spacecraft. Marcus had never seen anything like it. The ship seemed to be grown rather than built, with organic curves and surfaces that pulsed with their own inner light. And standing at the center of it was the most magnificent dragon he had ever encountered. This dragon was easily twice the size of Lyralii, with scales that shifted through the deep blues and purples of a nebula. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with fundamental forces of the universe. I am a Strawwing, voice of the free flights and speaker for the dragon nations of the Outer Rim, she said, her words carrying clearly through the ship's communication system. We have come to retrieve our stolen people and to demand justice for the crimes committed against them. The dragons in question were lawfully captured according to the recognized rules of... Vexhai began, but a Strawwing cut him off with a gesture that somehow conveyed absolute authority. Silence, enslaver. You will speak when we give you permission. Her attention turned to Marcus. You are the human called Marcus Chun. I am, Marcus confirmed, trying to keep his voice steady. A Strawwing, I understand your anger, but starting a war won't help anyone. There are ways to seek justice through the Galactic Council, through diplomatic channels. Diplomatic channels? A Strawwing's laugh was like the sound of distant thunder. For 300 years, we have watched our people disappear into Vorthakian space, never to be seen again. For 300 years, we have filed protests and sought justice through your precious diplomatic channels. And for 300 years, the galaxy has ignored our pleas because dragons were conquered territory and therefore not entitled to the same rights as other sentient beings. Marcus felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. The dragon liberation hadn't just been about freeing the captives. It had been the spark that ignited centuries of accumulated grievance and righteous fury. What do you want? He asked. Justice. Reparations. The return of every dragon held in captivity throughout Vorthakian space. The punishment of those responsible for these crimes. and formal recognition by the Galactic Council that dragons are a free and sovereign people with the same rights as any other sentient species. The demands were reasonable from a moral standpoint, but Marcus could see the panic in the Vorthakian officers' faces. The Empire's entire economy was built on dragon labor. Their military relied on dragon magic for their most powerful weapons and defenses. Losing access to enslaved dragons would cripple their civilization. And if these demands are not met, Vexhai asked, his scales having faded to a pale, sickly color, then we will take our people by force and show the galaxy why the Vorthakian Empire spent so much effort keeping us chained. Astrawing's eyes began to glow with inner fire. You have forgotten what we were before you conquered us, slavers. We're going to remind you. The threat was clear, and Marcus could see on the tactical display that the dragons were moving into attack positions. Each squadron was positioning itself near a different orbital platform or military vessel, and energy readings suggested they were charging their magical abilities for combat. Wait, Marcus said urgently. There might be another way. What if we could arrange for the immediate release of all dragons in Vorthakian space, along with reparations and formal recognition of dragon sovereignty? Would that satisfy your demands for justice? You think the Empire will agree to such terms? Astrawing asked skeptically. Marcus turned to look at Vexhai, who appeared to be in the early stages of a nervous breakdown. Administrator, you've seen the news feeds. You know how the galaxy is reacting to the footage from the breeding facilities. How do you think they'll react if this turns into a shooting war with dragons defending their own people? The Empire cannot simply abandon centuries of lawful territorial expansion. Vexhai protested weakly. The Empire is about to lose everything if it doesn't find a peaceful solution to this crisis, Marcus countered. Look at your tactical display. How many orbital platforms do you think will survive if 300 free dragons decide to take them apart? How many of your ships can stand against beings who can channel cosmic forces through their will alone? As if to emphasize his point, one of the dragon squadrons briefly flared their magical abilities, sending energy cascades across their formation that registered on every sensor in the system. The display of power was both beautiful and terrifying, demonstrating capabilities far beyond anything the Vorthakians had encountered from their enslaved dragons. They're not even using their full abilities, Marcus continued. These are free dragons who've had centuries to develop their magic without artificial limitations. Do you really want to find out what they're capable of when they're fighting for their people's freedom? The bridge fell silent, except for the low hum of ship systems and the occasional beep from monitoring stations. Marcus could see the mental calculations happening in Vexhai's eyes as the administrator weighed the cost of war against the cost of surrender. Even if I were to agree to such terms, Vexhai said finally, I lack the authority to speak for the entire Empire. Such decisions would require approval from the High Council. Then contact them. Astrawing's voice cut through the ship's communication system. You have 1 standard hour to provide an acceptable response. After that, we will assume the Empire has chosen war. The next hour was the longest of Marcus's life. He watched as Vexhai frantically communicated with his superiors, trying to convince them that the dragon demands were not just reasonable, but necessary for the Empire's survival. Meanwhile, the dragons maintained their positions around Vorthak Prime, a constant reminder of the firepower aimed at the heart of the Vorthakian military. News feeds from across the galaxy showed the crisis escalating by the minute. Protests outside Vorthakian embassies had turned into full-scale riots on some worlds. Several major powers had begun moving military assets toward Vorthakian space, ostensibly for humanitarian monitoring, but clearly preparing for intervention if the situation deteriorated further. Perhaps most significantly, the escaped dragons from the breeding facility had begun sharing their stories on every communication channel they could access. Lyralii appeared on interview programs, speaking with quiet dignity about her years of captivity and the systematic abuse she had endured. Her words carried more weight than any politician's speech because her telepathic abilities allowed her to share actual memories with viewers. The galaxy was seeing, feeling, and experiencing the horror of the breeding programs firsthand. Public opinion was solidifying rapidly behind the dragon's cause. Dr. Chun, the communication officer, called out, "We're receiving a priority message from the Imperial High Council." The main view screen shifted to show a group of elderly Vorthakians in elaborate ceremonial robes. Marcus recognized the symbols of the Empire's highest governing body, though he'd never expected to be addressing them directly. "This is Counselor Thexmore, speaking for the High Council," the lead figure announced. "We have reviewed the current situation and the demands presented by the Free Dragon Nations. While we do not accept responsibility for actions taken within the lawful boundaries of Imperial territory, we are prepared to negotiate a peaceful resolution to this crisis." It wasn't exactly an apology, but Marcus could see it was the best they were going to get from a government that had built its entire identity around the conquest and enslavement of dragons. "What terms are you prepared to offer?" a Strawwing asked, her image appearing alongside the Vorthakian Council on a split screen. "The Empire is prepared to discuss the gradual transition of dragon populations to autonomous status," Counselor Thexmore said carefully. "This would include the establishment of protected territories where dragons could live according to their own customs, along with appropriate compensation for the inconvenience they have experienced." "You mean slavery," a Strawwing said flatly. "Call it what it was. And your offer is inadequate. We demand immediate freedom for all dragons, not gradual transition. We demand full reparations for 3 centuries of stolen lives and labor, not compensation for inconvenience. And we demand justice for those who implemented and maintained these policies, not diplomatic language that avoids responsibility." The negotiations continued for another 2 hours, with Marcus serving as an unofficial mediator between two groups who had every reason to distrust each other. Gradually, a framework began to emerge that both sides could accept, though neither was entirely satisfied. The final agreement included immediate freedom for all dragons in Vorthakian space, the establishment of dragon-controlled territories with full sovereignty, significant reparations to be paid over a 20-year period, and the creation of an international tribunal to investigate war crimes committed against dragons. In exchange, the dragons agreed to allow Vorthakian civilians to evacuate from territories that would be transferred to dragon control, to work with the Galactic Council in establishing new interspecies cooperation protocols, and to refrain from seeking revenge against individual Vorthakians who had not been directly involved in the abuse of dragons. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was a start. As the formal documents were being prepared, a Strawwing requested a private communication with Marcus. When a connection was established, her expression was softer than it had been during the negotiations. "You have done something remarkable, Marcus Chun," she said. "Not just in freeing our people from that facility, but in showing the galaxy that justice is possible when someone is willing to stand up for what is right." "I just did what anyone should have done," Marcus replied. "Though I have to ask, how did you mobilize so many dragons so quickly? I didn't expect you to return with a full military force." A Strawwing's laugh was warmer this time, like the sound of wind through crystal chimes. "You underestimate the Dragon Communication Network." The moment Lorelei and her companions reached free space, their stories spread to every dragon community in the galaxy. What you witnessed today wasn't just a rescue mission. It was the awakening of a people who had been scattered and divided for too long. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we rebuild. We reclaim our heritage, restore our communities, and make sure that what happened in those breeding facilities never happens to anyone again. And we remember the human who helped make it possible." As the communication ended, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. He'd come to Vorthak Prime thinking he was taking a consulting job. Instead, he'd found himself at the center of a liberation movement that would reshape the political landscape of the galaxy. The dragons were free. Not all of them yet, but the process had begun, and Marcus doubted anything would stop it now. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, and for the first time in centuries, the voices of the oppressed were being heard. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of impossible problem humans were supposed to be good at solving. 6 months after the liberation of the Vorthak Prime breeding facility, Marcus Chun found himself aboard the newly constructed dragon vessel Starfire's Dream, traveling toward the Outer Rim territories that were being established as the first sovereign dragon worlds in 3 centuries. The ship itself was a marvel of dragon engineering, grown rather than built. Its living hull responded to the crew's telepathic commands, and its organic systems could repair themselves during flight. Marcus was serving as the Terran Alliance's first official ambassador to the Dragon Nations, a position that had been created specifically for him after the galactic community recognized dragon sovereignty. It wasn't a role he'd ever imagined for himself, but then, again, nothing about the past 6 months had gone according to any plan he could have conceived. The liberation movement had spread faster than even a Strawwing had predicted. Within weeks of the Vorthak Prime incident, dragon communities across the galaxy had begun asserting their independence, often with the support of local populations who had been horrified by the telepathic testimonies broadcast during the crisis. The Vorthakian Empire had initially attempted to resist the liberation movement, but they quickly discovered that fighting free dragons was very different from controlling enslaved ones. A single dragon squadron had disabled an entire Imperial fleet near the Rigel system, demonstrating magical capabilities that made traditional military technology seem almost primitive. More importantly, the dragons had proven to be remarkably restrained in their use of force. They could have devastated Vorthakian worlds, but instead they focused on precision strikes against military and industrial targets while actively protecting civilian populations. The contrast between dragon conduct and the systematic cruelty of the breeding programs had won them even more support from the galactic community. Ambassador Chun came a familiar mental voice as Marcus stood in the ship's observation lounge, watching the stars stream past through the transparent hull. He turned to see Lyralii approaching, her golden scales now bright and healthy, restored by months of freedom and proper care. "Just Marcus, please," he said with a smile. "I never wanted to be an ambassador anyway. I'm still a xenobiologist at heart. And yet you've probably prevented more wars and saved more lives than most professional diplomats," Lyralii observed, settling onto one of the specially designed couches that accommodated dragon anatomy. "The reports from the liberation teams are remarkable. We've freed over 50,000 of our people in the past 6 months." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction at the numbers. The liberation had become a carefully coordinated operation involving dragons, human special forces, and sympathetic aliens from dozens of worlds. Each rescue mission was meticulously planned to minimize casualties while maximizing the number of dragons freed. "What's the status of the tribunals?" Marcus asked. Lyralii's expression darkened slightly. "Complicated. Many of the worst offenders have fled to territories beyond Galactic Council jurisdiction. But we've managed to prosecute several hundred cases, and the evidence is overwhelming. The breeding program documentation you copied has been particularly valuable. The war crimes trials have been difficult, but necessary." Marcus had testified at dozens of them, providing expert testimony about the conditions he'd witnessed and the systematic nature of the abuse. Many Vorthakians had claimed they were simply following orders or didn't know how badly the dragons were being treated, but the recovered data files painted a clear picture of deliberate cruelty. "Any word from Administrator Vex High?" Marcus asked. "He's cooperating fully with the investigations in exchange for a reduced sentence," Lyralii replied. "Apparently, he's providing detailed information about other facilities and the higher-level officials who designed the breeding programs." Marcus nodded. Vex High had been one of the first to accept the reality of a new situation and work toward making amends. Not all Vorthakians have been so pragmatic, but enough had that the transition was proceeding relatively peacefully. The ship's communication system chimed softly, indicating an incoming message. A moment later, a Strawwing's voice filled the observation lounge. "Marcus, Lyralii, please join me on the bridge. We're approaching Drakaheim, and there's something you need to see." Dracaheim was the first world being transformed into a dragon homeland, a planet that had been abandoned by its original inhabitants millennia ago, but retained the kind of natural beauty and magical resonance that dragons preferred. Marcus had been eager to see how the dragons were adapting to their newfound freedom. When they reached the bridge, Marcus found a strawwing standing before the main view screen with an expression of wonder that seemed almost childlike despite her ancient dignity. "Behold," she said simply. The planet, rotating slowly on the screen, was breathtaking. Where the initial surveys had shown a world of empty continents and dead oceans, Marcus now saw something that defied easy description. The land masses were covered with structures that seemed to grow organically from the earth itself, crystalline spires that caught and reflected light in impossible patterns, vast gardens that appeared to be cultivated by magic rather than technology, and cities that flowed like living things across valleys and mountainsides. "How long has the terraforming been going on?" Marcus asked in amazement. 3 months, a strawwing replied. "But this is not terraforming as other species understand it. This is dragon magic working in harmony with the world's natural forces. We are not imposing our will on the planet. We are awakening its potential." As they drew closer, Marcus could see dragons in flight around the growing cities, their forms adding scale to structures that were already enormous. But what struck him most was the sense of joy and purpose that seemed to radiate from everything on the planet's surface. These dragons weren't just building homes. They were creating something entirely new. "The children are the most remarkable," Lyralii said softly, joining them at the view screen. "Dragons who have never known captivity, who have grown up free to explore their abilities without limit. They're already showing magical potential that exceeds anything in our historical records." Marcus watched a group of young dragons soaring between the crystal spires, leaving trails of colored light that hung in the air like aurora. They moved with a grace and power that spoke of beings in complete harmony with their abilities. "What about the formerly captive dragons?" Marcus asked. "How are they adapting?" "Better than we dared hope," a strawwing answered. "The healing circles have been working continuously, not just repairing physical damage, but helping our people remember who they were before their imprisonment. Some of the breeding females weren't sure they wanted to continue living at first. The trauma was so severe. But seeing their children grow up free, experiencing their own magic returning, it's given them reason to hope again." The ship settled into orbit around Dracaheim, and Marcus found himself looking forward to visiting the surface. But first, there was official business to attend to. "The Terran Alliance has asked me to present a formal proposal," Marcus said, turning to face both dragons. "Earth wants to establish a permanent embassy here, with full diplomatic relations between humanity and the dragon nations. We'd also like to propose joint research initiatives, humans studying dragon magic, dragons learning about human technology, sharing knowledge that could benefit both species." A strawwing considered this for a moment. "And what does humanity hope to gain from such an arrangement?" Marcus smiled. "Knowledge, friendship, and the chance to be part of something incredible. Humanity has always been fascinated by magic, by possibilities beyond what our science can explain. But more than that, we want to make sure that what happened to your people never happens to anyone again. An alliance between dragons and humans could serve as a powerful deterrent against future atrocities. There are those among my people who still distrust humans," a strawwing admitted. "They point out that humanity knew about the breeding programs for decades without taking action. It was only when one individual chose to act that change became possible." "That's fair criticism," Marcus acknowledged. "But it's also why this alliance is necessary. Individuals can make a difference, but lasting change requires institutional commitment. If Earth formally recognizes dragon sovereignty and commits to defending it, that becomes part of human law and policy, not just the conscience of one scientist." Lyralii had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. "There's another consideration. The liberation movement has shown that dragons and humans work well together. Your technology complements our magic in ways we're still discovering. The rescue operations have been far more effective than either species could have achieved alone. She was right. The liberation missions had become models of interspecies cooperation, with human intelligence and logistics supporting dragon magical abilities. The combination had proven devastatingly effective against Vorthakian forces while minimizing casualties on all sides. I believe we should accept the Human Alliance proposal, Astralling decided, but with conditions. Earth must agree to support dragon sovereignty in all galactic forms, commit to joint military action if our people are threatened, and share all intelligence about remaining dragon captivity situations. Done, Marcus said immediately, though I should point out that my government will probably want more detailed negotiations about the specifics. Of course, but the principle is established. Astralwing turned back to the view screen, where Dracaheim continued its slow rotation. Now, shall we go see what our children have built? The shuttle ride to the planet's surface was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Instead of the mechanical vibration and engine noise he was accustomed to, the dragon-grown vessel moved through space with organic smoothness, its hull singing with harmonics that seemed to resonate with the approaching world. As they entered the atmosphere, Marcus got his first close look at the dragon cities, and he understood why Astralwing had seemed so wonderstruck. These weren't buildings in any sense he recognized. They were living art, structures that pulsed with their own light and seemed to grow and change even as he watched. The largest spire stretched over 1 kilometer into the sky, its crystalline surface reflecting and refracting sunlight into patterns that formed moving murals in the air above the city. Smaller structures flowed around its base like tributaries feeding a river, each one unique, but clearly part of a larger design. How is this possible? Marcus asked as they descended toward a landing platform that seemed to form itself from the spire's surface as they approached. Dragon magic isn't just about manipulating energy, Lyralii explained. It's about understanding the fundamental connections between all things: matter, energy, consciousness, intention. When dragons work together with focused purpose, we can encourage matter to take forms that express our collective vision. You're literally willing things into existence, Marcus said in amazement. Not willing, inviting. We invite the crystal to reach toward the sky, the metal to flow like water, the stone to sing with light. Magic is about cooperation, not domination. As they landed, Marcus was greeted by a delegation of dragons unlike any he'd encountered before. These were clearly the children Lyralii had mentioned, young dragons who had grown up free, their scales bright with colors that seemed to shift based on their emotions rather than following the patterns Marcus had learned to read in older dragons. The lead youngster couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but her scales shimmered with power that made the air around her dance with tiny sparks of light. "Welcome to Dracaheim, Ambassador Chun," she said, her mental voice carrying notes of excitement and curiosity. "I'm Star Weaver, and I've been chosen to show you our home. The adults say you're the human who helped set our people free." "I helped, yes," Marcus replied carefully. "But your people freed themselves. I just gave them an opportunity." "The elders say that's what makes you special among humans," another young dragon chimed in. "Most species want to control us or use our power for their own benefit. But you helped us become what we were meant to be." As they toured the growing city, Marcus began to understand the full scope of what the dragons were creating. This wasn't just a settlement. It was a new form of civilization entirely, one that integrated magic, art, community, and harmony with the natural world in ways that challenged every assumption he'd held about social organization. The dragons had no traditional government, no currency, no formal laws. Instead, they operated through consensus and mutual aid, with decisions emerging from the collective telepathic network that connected all members of the community. Conflicts were resolved through empathic sharing that allowed all parties to understand each other's perspectives directly. What about dragons who prefer solitude? Marcus asked as they visited a community workshop where dozens of dragons were collaborating on what appeared to be a sculpture the size of a building. They have their own territories, Starweaver explained, gesturing toward distant mountains that glowed with their own inner light. Dragon society has always included hermits and solitary scholars. But even they remain connected to the network, contributing their knowledge and receiving support when needed. The most remarkable part of the tour was the nursery, where dragon hatchlings who had never known captivity were learning to use their abilities. Marcus watched in fascination as infant dragons barely larger than house cats manipulated light and energy with casual ease, their play sessions resembling controlled demonstrations of fundamental physics. "They're so much stronger than previous generations," one of the adult caretakers explained. "Captivity didn't just harm individual dragons. It weakened our species as a whole by preventing the development of our full potential. These children represent what we could have been if we'd been allowed to evolve naturally." Marcus spent 3 days on Dracaheim, documenting everything he could about dragon society while also conducting the formal negotiations for the Human-Dragon Alliance. By the time he prepared to leave, he had a comprehensive report for the Terran Alliance that would revolutionize human understanding of what was possible when sapient species worked together instead of competing. On his final evening on the planet, Marcus found himself at the base of the Great Spire, watching the sunset paint the crystal structure with colors that had no names. Lyralii joined him there, her own scales reflecting the spire's light in subtle harmonies. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Regret what?" "Giving up your old life. You were a respected scientist, comfortable and secure. Now you're an ambassador to a species that didn't officially exist 6 months ago, dealing with political situations that didn't have precedence until you created them." Marcus considered the question seriously. His old life had been simpler, certainly. Studying alien life forms was challenging work, but it didn't involve the kind of moral complexity and life-or-death decisions he'd been facing since Vorhack Prime. But then he looked up at the spire, knowing it represented the dreams and hopes of thousands of beings who had been freed from captivity. He thought about the young dragons he'd met, growing up with possibilities their parents never imagined. He remembered the despair in the breeding facilities and the joy on this world, and he knew there was really only one answer. "No," he said simply. "I don't regret any of it. Sometimes the universe presents you with a choice that defines who you are. Help or walk away. Speak up or stay silent. Do what's right or do what's safe. I'm glad I chose to help." Lyralii smiled, her scales shifting to warm gold in the fading light. The galaxy is changing because of that choice. Not just for dragons, but for everyone. Other oppressed species are beginning to speak up, demanding justice for their own suffering. The Centaurian refugee camps, the Silicon Commune mining collectives, the genetic modification programs on Kepler-7. All of them are citing the dragon liberation as proof that change is possible. Marcus felt a complex mix of pride and humility. He'd wanted to help a few captive dragons, and instead had apparently started a galactic civil rights movement. "What's next?" he asked. "Tomorrow, you return to Earth to finalize the alliance agreements," Lyralii said. "Next month, the first dragon delegation will visit Terra to establish our embassy. And after that, we'll see where the future takes us." As the stars emerged overhead, Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with the golden dragon in her prison cell just 6 months ago. She'd asked for help, and he'd given it. But in return, the dragons had given him something far more valuable. They'd shown him what was possible when beings chose cooperation over domination, healing over vengeance, and hope over despair. The galaxy was indeed changing, and Marcus Chun, former xenobiologist turned accidental diplomat, was proud to be part of that transformation. As he prepared to board the shuttle that would take him back to the Starfire's dream, Marcus paused for one last look at the Dragon City. The spires were beginning to sing their evening song, harmonies that carried across the valley and up into the night sky like prayers made of light and sound. Tomorrow, he would return to Earth with news that would reshape humanity's place in the galaxy. But tonight, he was content to stand beneath alien stars and listen to the music of a people who had rediscovered their freedom. It was, he thought, the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. The human who had come to study dragons had instead learned to help them fly free. And in doing so, he had discovered that sometimes the greatest scientific discoveries weren't found in laboratories or databases, but in the simple act of recognizing another being's pain and choosing to do something about it. The stars sang with dragon magic, and Marcus Chun smiled as he listened to the future being born.